Good morning, Carina. Thank you for being here. Carina Filek, who is COO of Elevate Staffing, a global company that provides staff to all sorts of events and occasions around the world. And Carina and I have known each other for a few years. Carina came on our Quality of Mind program a few years ago. And so we are here today to really just have a dialogue, to explore and to share. I see in some of the things that she says and the impact that it's had on her life. I think there's some real nuggets in there that I'd love to explore with you today, Carina, and hopefully they'll be valuable to people.
Sounds good.
So thank you. So where should we start? What would you like to say about? Yeah, I guess what have you learned about the mind that's been of significant value to you over recent years and through this work?
I think there's been lots of things that over time, things have solidified more as a result of the experience that I went through during the training, and more continues to come through, actually. But I think the piece I always go back to is the ability to recognize what's going on in my mind a little bit more than perhaps I was unable to do before. And just the knowing and seeing the power of thought for what it is has been really helpful. I think I remember during the retreat, and I've said this several times, you said you wanted it to be something that was transformational, and I remember being a little bit dubious about it. And it wasn't an overnight piece, but I definitely feel that it has been transformational for me, just knowing that my mind works in a certain way and it doesn't have to run me, and I can have more recognition over it. I think has been something that's been super powerful for me.
Wonderful. So can we dig into that, and what exactly do you see then differently about your mind and the way that thought's working that is useful to you?
I think previously I wouldn't have stopped and perhaps been as curious as what I am today. It's definitely made me show up differently, and rather than having a thought and racing ahead and forming beliefs and actions and just going about my day to day, I perhaps pause a little bit more than I may have done in the past, and been more curious and recognize, am I making an assumption with this thought? Is it something that exists? Am I thinking something and creating some crazy reality that I've made up in my mind? And I could be worried about something, and perhaps
Wonderful.
I haven't got any need to be.
Yes.
I run off and do things differently now.
Awesome. So just to give some context to this, is what we're saying, what we're exploring about the mind is how the mind creates the reality that we live within. And so we're having thousands of thoughts, and the thoughts come along and they create the reality that we experience. It feels really, really real. And so I get immersed in it. And as I get immersed in it, I think it's real, but it's just a bunch of thoughts. That's kind of what you're pointing at, right? And so yeah, there's this ability to step back and go, well, hang on a second. Am I just making that up? Is that some sort of story that my mind is creating? But do I know it's true? I think you said a minute ago.
Yeah, totally. And none of us are perfect, but the ability to do it more often than not is something that I found really powerful. Sure, I find instances where I might let my thoughts run away, but there's definitely more occasions where I pause and I check in. And it might be that I check in with somebody else. It might not just be me. That's another thing that's been really powerful for me when I engage with people. Instead of thinking I know what they're talking about, or thinking I know how they're feeling, or making like all these assumptions, I might stop and I'll question a lot more, which has been super amazing and powerful for me. It's one of my favorite takeaways from it, and something I wax lyrical about all the time is how curious can you be?
Right. Awesome. Okay, so So you're pointing at the fact there that we live in entirely separate realities. So you and I could be having a conversation, or we could have had a meeting yesterday, and I go off with a bunch of thoughts about the situation, or you or me in that meeting, and I create a story in my head unknowingly. Before I know it, I'm living in a story that says, you know, you didn't like what I said. And so you're immersed in this story. And if we just live in the story of our head, if we're not checking in and getting curious about how other people saw it, then we could be living in cuckoo land.
Absolutely. And I replay a story when I talk to people, especially at work, about this experience that I've gone through and the learnings that I continue to take from all this work. I tell stories around that point quite frequently, about not assuming that you know what somebody else's reality is and how that can impact their outcome. And it always seems to resonate. So I think it's something that shows up for a lot of people, that we just go on this our day to day and we don't check in as much as we need to.
Yeah. So have you got any examples you can think of where you do this, or you've done it, or could you give anything that comes to mind?
I've got the story that I share. The story that I tell to kind of demonstrate the point. It normally comes, it could be when I'm working with someone in the business, when they're pitching or presenting, or they're worried about how they're perceived and judgment of others. And there's a story I tell about, I'm in a pitch room with a colleague that I'm working with who's worked really, really hard on a pitch, and they're presenting to the client. And the client isn't particularly responsive. So the person next to me is pitching, and they're going through all of their hard work, and they're hitting every point, but they're not getting much back, even though they're trying. So they're speeding up, and they're getting faster and faster and faster, and they're making the assumption, because they're not getting anything back. And I know this from after the fact, we had a conversation about it, but they made the assumption that because they're not getting any response, they're probably not interested, and they just want to get through the meeting as fast as possible. So they continue to speed up, and then the client glances at their watch, and it just makes everything so much worse. And it kind of, I can see this person next to me almost slightly falling apart now, because he's been shaken by the fact that he thinks they don't want to be in the room, he hasn't got time, he's glanced at his watch, what's the next meeting, etc. So I saw what was going on, and I took a moment and I paused the meeting, and I said to the client, I said, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Can I just take a moment to check in? I can see you've glanced at your watch. Have you got somewhere else to be? Do we need to reschedule? Do we need to wrap up? Let me know what's going on. And the client turned around and said, well, no, you said you needed sign off by the 10th. So I was just checking the date to make sure I've got enough time to let you know that we can give you the work and you can go and do what you need to do. And then that changed the whole course of the meeting. And I think there was a risk there, if we hadn't have checked in, that we could have thrown the pitch, because we'd have skipped over details perhaps and not said the important things, got out the room as fast as possible. So that's the story I tell that seems
amazing example. Wonderful, right? Well, I so love it. So there we are with somebody else, and they've got certain things going on, behaviors, mannerisms, whatever they're doing, and of course our mind is making that mean something. It's making it mean something all the time. And so we see those signs, and then we just live in the story in our head about what those signs mean. And so I love this, because all the time there's indicators going on in the outside world that we can pick up on, or we can just ignore them. We can ignore them, or we can ignore them and make a story about them. But it's like, I think it comes back to your point about getting curious, right? In every situation, if we see something that we don't know how to interpret, how do we then just get curious?
Yeah, I think my level of curiosity has gone to a completely different level compared to where I was several years ago, before I started learning about, some quality of my own principles. And I think especially as being a leader in a business, you quite often there is a risk of perhaps thinking that you need to have every answer, and asking questions when you don't know the answer could be seen as a weakness. But if you can get rid of that judgment and you can remain hyper curious, it allows an opportunity for so much more innovation and different perspectives and just different conversation that perhaps you wouldn't have been able to have if you hadn't have been curious, and you'd have think, oh, I've got to have an answer. I've got to lead this team. I'm just going to move ahead with my best thinking that I've got.
Yes. Now, what about what I experience is that some people have a layer of thinking that says they couldn't possibly ask that. So they see the client looking at their watch, and what you're doing there is you're asking, saying, "Look, I noticed you looked at your watch." But some people have thinking that says, "Oh my goodness, I don't want to be confrontational, or I don't want to be rude," which is another layer of thinking then that stops them doing what you've just done.
Yeah, there's definitely a level of comfort that you need to get to, I suppose, or recognize that it's actually the best place to be, but when you check in. So I've seen it also manifest in situations where perhaps I'm in a meeting or a conversation that isn't as in flow as possible as I'd like it to be, isn't as easy as I'd like it to be, and there's something going on and I don't know what it is. And maybe there's some non-verbal cues going on, maybe someone looks frustrated or whatever it might be. And it's definitely easier, I think, to just let that go and carry on and get to the end of the conversation and get your opinion across and try to convince them, perhaps, if that's what your MO is. But actually to check in and say, hang on a minute, like, what's going on here? I just want to check. You look like you're not potentially happy about what I'm saying. Am I reading that right? And it might be that you're not. It might be that they've just got a blinding headache. Who knows? And then, if you haven't, again, checked in, or it might be that actually they're really unhappy with what you're saying, and then you can dig into why. And that's really powerful. If you don't know why someone's unhappy or have a varying opinion against what you're saying, you're stopping opportunities for that innovation and more collaboration. And it can become really limiting if you don't check in.
Yes. The other thing that I noticed, though, as you're saying, is I'm reflecting on another reason it's easy not to, is I might have some thinking that says I don't want to hear anything bad. Yeah. It's difficult for me to hear something bad.
Yeah, and again, that's all that there's a big piece that I feel that I also continue to work on, and something again I talk about, which is around this fear of judgment, more thinking, more thought that we can have in our heads to make it a really noisy space and not be able to kind of navigate through clearly. And more often than not, people are worried about either asking a question and worried about how people are going to perceive them. What's that, all that judgment that goes on. When actually, more often than not, I think everybody's potentially wound up in their own world and they're really not bothered about judging you. But I think, getting comfortable with that, asking of those questions and recognizing that judgment is all just the thought that you make up in your mind sometimes, is really important. And it wasn't. I'm not saying it's just like a switched on moment that I was instantly able to like pause meetings and check in and ask all those things. But over time, it became like muscle memory. I got more and more comfortable with it.
Yes. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic. So there's a couple of things that dawn on me here. One is we're very focused on the outside world, what other people think. And the power and the simplicity and the peace of mind comes from being a stand for what you think. Mm-hmm. And really going inside for the answers and being less focused on what do they think? Do they like me? Do they think this is good? Do they think that? Do they think that? Etc. etc. And it's how do we increasingly turn inwards? Because what we can't be, we're not in control of what others think, and they're going to do whatever they do. Yes, we're all judging each other all the time, actually. It's like, how do we just accept that that's part of life? And so then we can get on not worrying about it, because you are going to be judging me in some way. So I might as well focus on being who I want to be in this world. And at least you'll judge me for that, rather than for me then, this other version of me that might be nervous about you judging me.
Yeah, totally.
So tell me more. Where else is your understanding of the mind helping you?
I think it's having more. It's the ability to think more clearly without so much of the noise. Because I think there was a lot of thought perhaps that was going on before that wasn't helpful, and because I didn't recognize it, it had the impact of clouding my mind. Notifications all over the place. And I've lost my train of thought. What was you asking me? Ask the question again.
We were exploring a noisy mind, and you talked about having more clarity now.
Yeah, that's a good example of a noisy mind and a notification going off in the background, wasn't it? Perfect.
Yeah, good. Thank you for sorting that out.
Could happen again. And I think there's definitely at times under pressure or stress, there's more risk of that happening. And I knowing that is really helpful, because sometimes I'm not really tuned into what's going on. And it could be because there's a lot of external factors going on. I've got lots of conversations or lots of pressure or whatnot. And I can suddenly draw on the ability to go, hang on a minute, lots of this is noise. What can I navigate through? What can I recognize isn't helpful? What's drama, and what's driving some of my thinking that might not be helpful? And I remember you saying once about the example of, if it feels like a soap opera, it's possibly not helpful thinking. It's up and down. And I've definitely experienced lots of soap operas in my time, and it's conversations or engagements with people. And it's like, how can you get away from that? And how can you get to a much more smoother place that is better for everybody? So that noise is sometimes contributing to the drama, and this thinking that can go run wild in your mind. So yeah, there's those moments of pressure, and perhaps the noise starts to come through a little bit more loudly. It's just knowing, okay, I'm under pressure. Let's take a moment. Let's recognize what's going on, and let's have a reset moment.
How easy is it for you? How easy is it for you to do that? And how do you notice that?
It's the drama. It's this, I do this all the time. You notice what's going on because it feels dramatic. It feels hyper emotional. There's perhaps lots of personal thinking going on. You're not being as curious as you might want to be, or as you might usually be, because you're under this pressure and you're just trying to get through. And it's not always easy to pull back from that. But I know when I do, and you kind of reset those moments or reset those conversations, the outcome is the vast majority of the times always better. It's always a better experience. You have better engagements if you just trust in your ability to live in the moment and know that you've got the power within you to have a great conversation without this fear or this judgment or this worry or whatever the noise is you might have going on. You just have a much richer, more productive experience. From what I found anyway.
Yeah, awesome. And so what I notice is that I can feel it in the body as well. It's like if I'm in a low quality of mind, if I'm caught up with noise, I'm probably feeling pretty shitty in some way. And so the body is an indication for the level of the quality of my thinking. And so the body's sort of going, hey, don't don't do anything too serious now, because actually you're not in a great space, Martin. And the other thing I notice is that this often, can happen more towards the end of the day when we're tired and we've had loads of things going on. And so it's how to recognize those signs and go, hey, I'm not going to listen to I'm not going to try and work this out now. I'm not in the right space for it. And lo and behold, you do some exercise or you sleep and wake up in the morning and the thoughts, the thinking is just, or the experience of the thinking is totally different. It's amazing.
And I think that's really interesting because sometimes it's as simple as removing yourself from a situation and taking a pause, going for a walk, revisiting something the next day when you're feeling better about it, and you'll have a completely different experience. And it feels really obvious when you say it out loud, but when you're in the moment, you feel like you have to just get through because you perhaps you don't want to recognize what's going on, or you don't have the ability to recognize what's going on, so you just keep plowing through, and it's all really noisy, and noise is telling you to go one way or another. And if you just take a pause, actually, if you come back next time or when you're feeling better, the outcomes are going to be much more productive and a nicer feeling experience. You were saying when you feel it in the body, it's also, I love the when you've had a really great conversation with somebody and you've engaged with somebody and it's really in flow and there's no noise and it's really curious and wandering and all of those things, and afterwards you feel something, you feel warm inside, it feels good. And I mean, who doesn't want more of that? Right?
Yeah. I love this, that feeling is awesome, and that flow is a beautiful word to use. Is like there's a flow in the conversation. It's not being controlled or worried about, or there's no judgment. It's just sort of happening, right?
Yeah.
And when we should all
wonder a bit more.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? He says wondering.
Yeah. I think having an environment or having a conversation or a space where the freedom to wonder without judgment is really powerful. And I've done it at work a few times where you set a space and you allow people just to contribute wondering thoughts. And we go into a conversation to say, okay, we're going to have some thinking about perhaps the challenge we've got. And, the old saying, no idea is a bad idea, and, brainstorms and all that. But it's another level. I think it's setting a framework to say, let's just, have a wondering conversation and see where it goes. It might not go anywhere. And that's fine, but it might be something really powerful that comes out of it. So I think, giving people freedom and enabling a safe space to be able to wonder and have that freedom of thought is really important as well.
Wonderful. So I think there's a couple of points here that feel quite important to mention, which is, well, one is we often are fixed in our opinion. We often come into a discussion knowing what we think should happen. And we might have some fixedness around that. We might have some defensiveness around that. And we already show up into the meeting with ready for a bit of a fight to defend. The ego wants to defend its opinion and feel good and feel right. And so, but with that, there's no flow then that's possible in the conversation. There's tightness. And so what you're pointing at is this, let's let go of, we might have had opinions before we came to this meeting, but let's let go of them. Let's let go of them entirely. And then what you're talking about is there's a space that's available where we can access a whole bunch of ideas and thinking that we didn't even know about before. So magic can occur. Like incredible miracle ideas can pop out if we create this space. I think that's what you're pointing at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And often when you come into a conversation, we're all there normally with the same goal, the same outcome. We're there with a passion and intent to do right by whatever it is we're trying to achieve. And I think sometimes having this like fixed position is coming from a really good place inside. But because we think we have to show up and defend our position and get it over, and not recognize, okay, hang on a minute, if I just push that to a side and have a more curious conversation, something that's more wondering, I'm not wedded to my position because I care about the end goal. Everybody does in that conversation. So if you can see that moment in time and be less fixed, it's going to allow for all those moments of magic that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do if you're kind of battling to get your point across, and the ego takes over and all that noise starts to come in and stops you having that more free-flowing conversation, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that occurs to me now then is I'm often doing that if I lack confidence in some ways. If I'm a little bit insecure and I feel like I need to prove something, then it can create this energy of I need to prove something. I've got an idea and I want to stick to it. And so what strikes me is the more relaxed I can be about, more comfortable with self, more relaxed I am in my own skin, the more I can sink into that. I'm interested then in your view of your journey, of your own confidence and your own inner authenticity and strength, and what's happened to that through this journey of yours.
Yeah, I've definitely had a few key moments throughout this journey where I've felt something change or something click. And it's when I've made a decision to trust in myself a bit more, to know I have the knowledge that I need to carry me through whatever the moment in time might be. And I'm hyper present in whatever that moment is, instead of worrying about my ability or worry about my confidence or how I'm perceived or any of those things. If I choose to just switch on in the moment, I've had a few moments where I'm like, wow, that was incredibly powerful. And I think it could have been completely different if I'd have gone into it worrying about what the meeting would have been or situation would have been. And I'd prepared a lot and I scripted what I was going to say and I thought about all the outcomes and all of those things. But in fact, when I just let go and trusted in myself, like, magic happens. And it can sound really, woo-woo, as I say. But I've definitely experienced some moments like that have been really powerful for me. So you don't just have to let go and trust in yourself sometimes. You have it within you to do some incredible things. Yes.
But in some ways, my experience of this is you're sort of getting out of the way, right? The Carina doesn't need to manage it or control it or work it out or fix it or sort it, or it's like you sort of get out of the way. Yeah, it's trusting in self. You could call it that, but it's almost like in the moment of being magical and amazing, you're not really doing it. It's kind of just happening, right?
Yeah.
It's like the person that saves a child from a fire and rushes into a fire and they come out and everyone says, oh wow, that was so courageous, but they weren't thinking about it in the moment. They were just operating instinctively. Or the person that scores a penalty in a cup final or something. It's like they're just in this state of ease and flow, and then, which you could call trusting yourself, but in some ways it's sort of getting out of the way, actually.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. That's a better way of putting it. I think it's that you said there, that acting instinctively. Sometimes we get in the way of that acting instinctively, right? And normally when we act instinctively, it's the right thing, because we're showing up as the way that we know that we can and we have the power to do, and we're not getting in the way, as you say. Yeah, it's a really good way of putting it. I like that. I might borrow that, Martin.
Yeah. because there's this feeling of like, after you do an amazing presentation or you save the child in the fire or whatever, is like, and everyone says, well done, and you're like, well, I how did you do it? I mean, I'm like, I don't know, I didn't do anything. It just sort of happened.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got another question for you, which is, what's happened to your leadership? Is there any other elements of your leadership that you look at and see that has evolved or shifted through this?
It's definitely impacted how I am as a leader. It's made me a better leader. I believe. I think it does come back to communication at the core of it, and my ability. And I often find when I'm doing work or when I'm working with people that the communication is often the problem in one way, shape, or the form. It's the like root cause, and being able to apply some of the learning from the journey that I've been on, the quality of mind work. It's transformed the way that I communicate through the things that we've spoken about today, whether it's checking in and being hyper curious, being more compassionate, recognizing that I don't need to have every single answer, and I want to surround myself with people who are experts and have the answers. And just because I'm a leader doesn't mean I need to know everything. And that's been massively transformational for me. My ability to engage with people differently has meant that my leadership has become much more effective, I believe, and it feels good. And I wouldn't want to go back to a different space. Now I know that I can exist in that space. I wouldn't want to do anything differently from here on. And I constantly work on reminding myself to check in and remember some of the principles, and it's a journey. And I say that quite a lot to people when I talk about some of the work that I've done on this, that this did not happen overnight. It continues to happen. I'm still learning. Doesn't happen 100% of the time for me, but I know that working on the way that I communicate is, it sounds like a really obvious thing that everybody does as a leader, but doing it in a way that considers the quality of my principles that we've worked on really helps me have really effective change when it comes to my communication.
Awesome. And one of the things I noticed, Carina, about you on this journey is that I love is your authenticity. What I would call authenticity is, I think sometimes we talk about persona, right? We develop this persona because we think we need to be a certain way. We can't say that on LinkedIn. We can't write that. We can't. We need to present ourselves in a certain way, and because we're worried about what other people think, or we think we need to be a certain way for other people to be accepted in the world or in our organization, and so on. And what I see in you, I don't know if you see yourself this way, but this is how my perception is. There's just an authenticity. This is who I am. This is what I think. And there's a relaxedness in that. And I think that's a really important thing in this world today, especially with so many divisive and differing opinions on so many different topics. But it's like, how do we just stand in who we are and what we think? Not like we're right or fixed in it, or we're making other people wrong, but just to have an authenticity about, how we want to show up in the world.
Well, I'll take that as a good thing. And it's the authenticity, I think, comes from just really considering what's going on for other people. I often think about some of the simple things, perhaps, that I feel that might show up for me, or simple things, the way that I might manage any kind of, like I've been talking about recently, like imposter syndrome elements or struggles or noise. And sometimes we don't talk about those basics because other people might not see them as basics. And I think just going back to those really kind of fundamental points is something that I enjoy doing and feels authentic to me. And I'm just sharing my experience ultimately, and hopefully it's helpful for others. I mean, if we all get out of our own heads and we listen more, sometimes there's some things that we can take from that. So if I can help share my experience and that does something positive for somebody else, then and that's a great day.
Awesome. So I've got one last question for you, because I know you've written about this in the past. I'd just love to talk to you about mental health and your view of mental health with the understanding you've now got about the mind.
Yeah.
Because there's a pandemic going on, mental health, there's a massive focus on it. There's a lot of illness going on in our society on so many levels. What are your views on this, and what do you see now?
I think it's great that there's a lot more conversation about it, first of all. You know, I think perhaps looking back years ago, there wasn't as much accepted conversation around it. So that's brilliant. That's point number one. I think there's a lot more tools out there, so that's helpful. But with all of that, there's a lot more noise. All the devices that we have, we're plugged in all of the time. There's, you know, we're hyper connected to what's going on in the world out there. So we've got all of this stuff coming at us all of the time that is driving potentially some challenges when it comes to our mental health. It's amping up our stress, it's driving anxiety and all of those things. And there's no magic wand. But what we can do is to recognize it more and to talk about it more and to look at, I like looking at small tactics that you might be able to deploy to help get through some of this stuff. And yes, there'll be some underlying causes sometimes, and some situations may be more extreme than other. But having like a toolkit that you can go back to help look after your mental health is a way that I like to approach it. And making sure that it remains a topic on the agenda and that we do something about it as well.
So can I throw in a challenge here? Because I think there is a magic wand.
Oh, okay.
Ha ha. Ta-da. And now, listen, I'm going to preface this with, I'm not an expert on mental illness. I'm not an expert. I'm not a psychiatrist. I understand that there may be, for some people, chemical imbalances and all sorts of things going on. But having experienced some form of depression myself a long while ago, the magic wand for me is shifting my relationship to my thinking. Because in any moment, if I'm caught up in what my mind is creating, if I'm caught up in the stories about the world or my situation or my lack of money or my job that I don't like or my boss that worries me or my partner that, you know, if I am really, really caught up in the content of my mind, then I feel sad, I feel awful. And that is mental. That's mental sadness, illness. But in the moment that I see that I'm living immersed in a story, when I see that really deeply, actually I'm well. And innately, I mean, we say in this work, innately, we're all well. Mentally, we're all well. It's only when we meddle with our system and get immersed in our thinking that we cause ourselves to not be well.
Yeah, I think we're in a system, aren't we, where it's expected to kind of behave and think in a certain way, and I think that magic wand that you've just referenced there isn't the norm. So how do we do more of that is obviously the question and the ambition, and it's not something that necessarily comes as a default and a natural operating system to people. But you know, again, talking about it more and showing that there's a different way to experience reality and knowing that the power of your thought is what it is, can only help, you know, bring that further to the front. And we all have the opportunity to do that more for each other. So yeah, look, we need to keep talking about it and keep supporting each other and keep reminding each other of what opportunities exist.
Wonderful. Any last comments, Karina?
It's been a pleasure. I always thoroughly love these conversations. It's always nice to have a wander down this path, and I continue to talk about the quality of mind work that we've done. And I've said this to you before, and I'm not saying it just for effect. I talk about it all of the time. It made such an impact on my life personally, professionally, and I continue to embrace it. And I look forward to seeing where it takes me in the future. So yeah, it was great to chat today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks.